Afternoon, or evening. Welcome to the Canadian Association for Refugee and Forced Migration Studies, CARFMS 2022 conference on crisis and forced migration, manifestations of power in a changing world. My name is Dr. Stephanie Stobie, and as president of CARFMS, I would like to thank Dr. Anna Perkey and the Human Rights Program at United College at the University of Waterloo for hosting this year's online conference. They have been fantastic partners with us this year, and they've put an incredible amount of work into making this conference happen, along with CARFMS Secretariat, Michelle Millard, and the Conference Planning Committee. CARFMS has been very busy over the last year, and I wanted to share briefly some of our exciting initiatives. We're actually organizing 2 conferences within 6 months. This one and our first in-person conference in 3 years in May 2023 at York University in Toronto. We would love to see all of you there and renew our friendship in person. CARFMS has also spent some time re-engaging with students. We facilitated 2 online workshops for students and early career researchers and educators on writing conference proposals and presenting at conferences. In 2023, there will be a workshop on how to publish in a journal. Also, CARFMS is launching the Lived Experience of Displacement Essay Award in partnership with LEARN, Local Engagement Refugee Research Network at Carleton University, and BEAR, Borderless Higher Education for Refugees at York University. I wanted to highlight these for all those who might be interested and for those who might have students who would be interested in submitting papers. Also, CARFMS fall newsletter will be sent out and posted on our website. When we were planning this conference, there were still uncertainties with regards to COVID-19 and travels. The online format allows for more participants from around the world to join us in exploring the concept of crisis in both its negative and positive aspects as it relates to refugees and forced migration. In my field of conflict resolution studies, we examine how power influences conflict and that conflicts or crises are sometimes necessary to bring about positive social change. With the Ukraine-Russia war, the Taliban's return to power in Afghanistan, the military coup in Myanmar, intercommunal violence and community-based militias in South Sudan, food insecurity, climate crisis, and other conflicts around the world, the number of forcibly displaced people has risen to over 100 million in 2022, and the year is not done yet. The importance of preventing such atrocities is more vital today than ever to protect human life and security and to provide national, regional, and global stability and peace. I'm excited that this year's conference engages with leaders, scholars, practitioners, and students in examining crisis and forced migration, manifestations of power in a changing world. We have over 100 presenters from around the world exploring various topics under our 4 themes. 1, power, ideology, and disruption, challenging discourse and praxis. 2, representation, discrimination, and legitimacy, claiming space to be a refugee. 3, crisis, complicity, and responsibility, critical approaches to understanding root causes. 4, resistance, agency, and solidarity, reflecting on responses to forced displacement. And 5, best practices in forced migration research. I hope that you will attend as many sessions as possible over the next 3 days and engage in dialogue on these important issues. Now I would like to ask Dr. Anna Perkey, chair of the conference, to provide some housekeeping information before introducing our keynote speaker. Thank you and enjoy the conference.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Most of you already have met me one way or the other, primarily virtually. I'd also like to take this opportunity before we begin to thank Stephanie Brown and to extend my thanks to all of our student volunteers. Without them, this conference would not be possible. They will be providing technical support throughout each of the panels. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank all of those of you who volunteered to be a chair for a panel. It's only through your support that conferences such as this are able to take place. Now, in terms of housekeeping, I'd like to draw your attention to a few key sessions. In addition to the plenary sessions, which I hope that you will all attend, we are also going to be having 2 book launches over the lunch hour today. Don't worry, there will be plenty of time for you to take a full break and to get a bite to eat as well, but we will be starting those at 12:30, and I do invite you to join us for that. I'd also like to note that the Student Caucus will be holding a meeting from 1 to 1:30 today. So if you haven't looked at the schedule recently, that's a new addition. Students are a critical part of the work that we do here at CARFMS, and we are looking for better ways to serve them. And so I strongly encourage all students, either graduate or undergraduate, to attend this session. There will also be a virtual student drop-in cafe during the health break on Thursday afternoon and lunch on Friday. Over the next 3 days, we have quite a packed schedule, and it looks fascinating. Because of the number of presentations that we have, please try to stick to your allotted time and be respectful to your fellow presenters and to the panel chairs who will be keeping track of the timing. Also, I want to make you all aware, if you've done a feed loop conference before, you may know this, but feed loop sessions end automatically. So at the end of the session, when the time is up, everyone will be ejected from the virtual room, which is another key reason to try and stay within the time frame we aren't able to go over on the sessions. In terms of other administrative details, please remember to mute your microphone if you are not presenting. You have the choice whether or not to keep your video on. I also encourage you to post on social media if you so choose, and we ask that you use the hashtag CARFMS22. We have several volunteers who will be posting on social media, and they may take screenshots during the conference. If you do not want to have your image recorded, please turn off your video. If you are a presenter and do not want your image recorded, please inform either myself or our communications officer, Shane Wong, at shaynet.wong@gmail.com. So we will be recording the plenary sessions as well with the permission of the speakers. So that is something that we want to be able to post for the future to have as a record, and for those of you who, for perhaps because of the time change, are not able to attend these sessions. Today, we are going to start off our program with a truly excellent speaker. It is my sincere pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker today, the current Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada, Ketty Nivyabandi. Ketty will be presenting a brief talk, and then we will open it up for questions from the audience. Questions can be submitted on the Q&A session in the webinar. So Ketty was born in Belgium, but grew up in Bujumbura, Burundi, where she studied international relations and worked as a journalist and as a published poet. In 2015, during Burundi's constitutional crisis, Ketty led Burundi's first women-only protest and was a founding member of the Women and Girls Movement for Peace and Security. As a consequence of her political activities, she was forced to flee the country and sought asylum here in Canada. Since that time, she has continued her role as a global human rights activist and advocate, particularly focusing on women activist movements, and holding the role of advocacy and research manager at the Nobel Women's Initiative. As a former refugee who, in the space of only a few years, has come to occupy one of the most important human rights platforms in Canada, I can think of no one better to provide us with insight and to open this conference. And so please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker for CARFMS22, Ketty Nivyabandi.
Oh, thank you so much, Anna. I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me. If I could get a thumb up. Okay, it looks like you can. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm really, truly delighted and so happy to be with you today. And really wish to thank you, Anna, for your gracious invitation. Thank you, Stephanie, Michelle, and everybody involved in organizing this conference and making it a success. I'm truly happy and delighted. So yes, my name is Ketty Nivyabandi. I do serve as Amnesty International's Secretary General for the Canadian English section. A quite grand title, which I assure you brings me more premature gray hairs and sleepless nights than benefits many would think it does. I am joining you, and it's important for me to state this, from ancestral and unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, where I am very privileged to live with my two beautiful teenage daughters. I reflect, or at least attempt to reflect daily on the privilege that I hold living here, on the strength of Indigenous peoples, and what I have come and how what I have come to call home is no longer home for most Indigenous communities today. Because in many ways, Indigenous communities are the oldest internally displaced peoples of this land, a reality that I often feel is not examined enough, particularly from the lens of forced migration. So as always, before I speak, I ensure that I reiterate my deep gratitude for this land, for the stories and the lives that it holds, for its peoples, for its herstory and history, both exceedingly beautiful and harrowingly painful, for its sacred waters, the understanding as well that water, air, land are all part of life, for its ancestors, its knowledge keepers, its matriarchs who have nourished and held their people together through storytelling and ancestral traditions for centuries. I hold gratitude and hope for its children and spirited youth as well, and the liberating path that this new generation is already forging ahead. And as always, I ask for the blessings of those whose land my feet are on today, for I speak as a guest who lives in deep kinship with the experience of displacement, of dispossession, of colonization, and its enduring aftermath, coloniality. I say all this because it has never been more important to remember that most of us here are all guests on these lands. And I believe that this remembrance would profoundly reshape our understanding and our discourse on migration and hospitality, on land ownership and borders, on who is welcome and who isn't, who holds the right and the power to welcome, who does not, and how one welcomes. This acknowledgement is particularly important and relevant to me. I am, as you shared, Anna, after all, a daughter of the African soil, the heart of Africa, no less, to be more precise, who has been displaced by conflict, whose country and whose family has been fragmented by the experience of first German, then Belgian colonialism, and the many cycles of conflict that these continue to breed on my homeland today. I still identify as a refugee. I am a mother of refugee children who arrived on these shores just a few years ago and has had to navigate this country from its underbelly or a sub-city, a term that I borrow from a folk singer that I adore, Tracy Chapman, and her famous song. The experience of refuge and forced migration is not just one that I work on in my professional capacity as a human rights advocate. It cuts through the fabric of my life, the intimacy of my relationships, my aspirations, my dreams, or simply my mobility. It is, for instance, the reason why I am detained for hours at airports while I often watch my colleagues and friends walk through. It is the reason why I had such trouble finding adequate employment when I arrived on this land, because I did not have sufficient Canadian experience. And I mention this not to induce sympathy or outrage. It's still too early in the day, but rather to ground us in this very simple but enormously important fact: the power that forced migration holds on people's intimate lives. Just like race, like gender, like disability, being a displaced person is not an identity that one can put down. It is not a subject one gets to examine a few hours a day and put down once or one gets home. It permeates all layers of one's life, regardless of status or social class, ability. It is fundamentally an organizing force in people's lives. As Stephanie rightly pointed out earlier, there are now over 100 million people forcibly displaced globally. Over half of those are displaced within their own country, and over 26 million are refugees. These numbers can feel overwhelming to many people who see people moving across borders as a global crisis. And so, as I understand, the theme of the conference is, how do we approach this reality? How do we approach this growing beast? And by beast, I mean the astronomical number of people who are moving, but also how we approach it and how we conceive it as a crisis, which we seem unable or unequipped to deal with. How do we, in turn, claim power in the face of what seems or seeks to render us powerless, what seems impossible to manage? I'll just share some reflections with you, and I fundamentally think that we are at a crossroad and that we face a triple crisis from my perspective. Not a crisis of numbers, but rather a crisis of, first, imagination, a crisis of humanism and humanity. And to quote and to use the words of a dear friend and eminent scholar, Professor Saar, a crisis of relationality. How states, nations, and blocks of nations relate to one another, and particularly how the global North relates to the global South. And I'd like to talk about 3 ways in which I think power is exercised and crisis understood, which fundamentally need to be revisited if we are to find long-lasting solutions to what we're facing. And the first one is the why. Why are people leaving in the first place? Most of us in the human rights sector see and understand refugee and forced migration as a symptom rather than the anomaly. And I know that the root causes of displacement is a subject that will be discussed at this conference. We simply cannot continue to dissociate forced displacement and its solutions from the factors that create it. And these factors are a profound asymmetry of power in global governance. From resource extraction, unequal distribution of power, arms proliferation and militarism, all of these factors contribute to the experience of displacement. And we're watching it unfold right now with the Russian aggression on Ukraine. Russia, a country that is a member of the Security Council tasked with preserving peace and maintaining peace and security globally, violating its own rules and the international global order as it stood, to invade another country and in turn destabilize the rest of our world. We are right now experiencing inflation and socio-economic challenges that are a direct result of this crisis, destabilization of our global world order. And it is those who are already marginalized within our societies who feel this the most, as well as those countries that were already on the margins of a global economy. And so in this context, what a cruel irony would be to say to those whose borders have been violated, those who have been dispossessed of their lands, of their living spaces, those whose resources are still being plundered today, those whose raw material prices are being determined thousands of miles and kilometers away from their capitals, those who are bombarded with basic necessities, but to whom the worst weapons are being sold, those whose ecosystems are being destroyed, those who are chained in the global chains of inequality. What a cruel irony to tell them that they cannot live here or in certain places, that they do not belong, that instead we must harden our borders. What a cruel irony it is to set a limit to their hopes, to deny them the fundamentally human right to move, to spread their wings, a right that is born out of a simple and universal dream, that of freedom. Essentially, I believe, like many of you, I'm sure that this incessant flow of refugees and migrants reveal host countries to themselves. It simply reveals the deep contradictions of societies that call themselves today developed. And the management of this human migration is the contemporary test of our civilization. For how can we speak of development when human beings are locked on islands like subhumans, where children are torn away from their parents, or families locked in jail and incarcerated for having dared to look for another future? When human beings are imprisoned for having saved others from drowning in the Mediterranean Sea, trying to reach the shores of hope. The times we live in clearly call for much more than a logistical approach, more than a technical innovation in how we manage new arrivals. It calls us to fundamentally reform and shift our thinking around migration and what causes it. Which brings me to the second point that I wanted to talk about, which is one of the ways power is exercised, and that's the scale and the nature of our global response. I'll give you an example. Last year, around this time, a little bit earlier, I would say about September last year, our office was working day and night to try and relocate some Afghan families after the takeover of Kabul by the Taliban. We worked day and night to try and find solutions for these people, a group of people that were at high and acute risk, including women, young children. And I watched up close how several governments responded in the face of a real urgency and emergency situation. I watched the disparity between different countries, watched the response, the very bureaucratic, I have to say, response from the Canadian government at the time to a problem that was moving every hour. Watch how some states also came up with very creative solutions and were able to match the needs and the response needed by issuing immediate visas, being able to issue documents to people who had fled without their passports, without their papers. some countries found ways around that. Others simply locked themselves in bureaucracies. And fundamentally, the response remains largely unequal globally, unequal per country, but also unequal in relation to who's fleeing. So fast forward a few months later, I watched the response to the Ukrainian crisis and Ukrainian refugees from a Canadian standpoint being radically different. Solutions being found that enabled Ukrainian refugees to arrive in Canada on a very short basis, issuing temporary visas, finding solutions which had not been deployed for either refugees before, solutions which were good in the sense that they enabled people to flee and should be allowed and deployed across the board and not just for some, but also solutions that may have been short-sighted in the sense that many of these people were issued temporary visas and did not benefit from some of the social economic services that are available to refugees, to those who arrive in Canada as refugees. So again, a very ad hoc response, and a response that was certainly much better than the Afghan one, but still not adequate and still not systematic or consistent across the board. The bulk of refugee protection, as you all know, is falling on the backs of low and middle income countries. Over 80% of refugee protection goes to these countries who are already scrambling to manage their own social economic conditions. So not only are wealthier countries contributing to global instability with record high levels of inequality, these same countries are not doing enough to share the cost of protecting people who have left everything behind. Of course, I'm not telling you anything new, you know this. And although I don't work with from a humanitarian agency, I do know, as you do, that appeals for humanitarian assistance for refugees is consistently and often severely underfunded. And instead, what is funded, exceedingly so, are borders, tight controls, triage and policing of these borders, locking the rest of the world in cycles of violence, inequality, and displacement. It's clear that our world needs a new global plan based on genuine international cooperation and meaningful and fair sharing of responsibilities. We are simply not meeting the reality of displacement and its root causes at the scale that is needed. And that is the fundamental issue. We are sometimes finding creative solutions for groups, specific groups of individuals who are on the move, and will go a long way into displaying those and branding those often. However, they do not in any way meet or attempt to meet the scale of the challenges that we face. The third way in which power, in my view, is profoundly being exercised is one that is not always obvious, does not always seem concrete, especially in policy spaces, and that's the space of language. Words matter enormously, narratives matter enormously, and the use of the word crisis itself when it comes to refugees and migrants, as you have so rightly pointed out, may just be the real crisis. I fundamentally disagree that we are not dealing with a crisis of numbers. People are not and have never been the problem. It is the reasons that drive these families and individuals like me to cross borders that are the heart of the issue, as well as the short-sighted responses to them. And yet narratives which depict displaced persons as the other are not only on the rise, they are sophisticating their discourse, they're growing in audience, and they are becoming the foundation of electoral politics. the anti-migrant wave that is currently sweeping across Europe today, with frightening examples in Italy and France and Sweden, is also at play in the United States. It profoundly shaped the last election. And unlike refugees, these ideas do not face borders. They are gaining transnational momentum and strength. And they're also at play right here in Canada. So they demand that we not only equip ourselves for this wave, but that we radically shift the narrative itself around forced displacement. Just yesterday, the Minister of Immigration announced new immigration targets of 500,000 permanent residents by 2025. And in his statement, I observed the stress placed, the language and the underscoring that immigration is good for our economy. And I think it's important that we interrogate how we label those who are permitted to come into our borders. What do we communicate when we label, whether it's intentional or not, refugees and migrants as a labor opportunity? How are we shaping the way people inside the border see those outside? And do we not further other them in this process? The idea of deservingness, the underlying belief that to make sense, immigration must have a higher purpose than hospitality, is, in my view, a risky one at best. Perceptions, especially perceptions around people on the move, are constructed slowly over time. And this narrative, in turn, ends up feeding the very same discourse of invasion and replacement theory that is rising globally today. By framing immigration as an economic opportunity, we may also be feeding into a culture of ableism, where merit and entry is offered to those who can work versus those who can't, but are equally deserving of being welcomed on the simple basis of their humanity. So I worry about the extractive nature of this framing and who it leaves behind. The elderly, the disabled, the children, perhaps the sick, those who are already on the margins. So how do we move forward? Because my intention is not to depress you further with these facts, which I'm sure you're all very well aware of. But I think it's important that we frame these questions with the realities that they are grounded in. So how do we move forward? I wish I had clear-cut, ready-made solutions. I certainly would be applying them. There are solutions, such as, we need to do things differently. The challenge is, how do we get to that? But I still would like to explore a few ideas with you, 3 to be precise and for time purposes as well. The first is going back to the example that I shared earlier about bureaucracy responding to the mobility and agility of displacement. The first idea is simply practical, right? We need to be practical and agile in how we respond to refugee and forced migration overall. And here I'll mention a country that I've been mentioning a few times whenever I speak about forced migration and refugee, and that is Ireland, simply because I watched it, I observed it, and was quite struck by the level of and agility from policymakers, from bureaucrats, and from government in finding very practical solutions to let people in. again, going back to the Afghan example, I've watched Ireland being able to provide really quick solutions for people to enter the country, being able to respond on the go, being available 24 around the clock, 24/7, going around, understanding that people in situations like these do not have necessarily the documents that are needed, but finding solutions where, on the other hand, the Canadian administration still was operating in very rigid and bureaucratic ways. And again, I think the Ukraine example provides us with a clear possibility and range of actions that can be taken to respond in an agile, practical manner. The second approach, and this is perhaps much more big scale, is a decolonial one. One that is, and by that what I mean is an approach that is rooted in understanding that the distribution of power globally is at the heart of global displacement. And that no longer isolates scholars, academics, practitioners who work on forced migration to only focus on the migration, but to really focus on the core issues that are causing this migration in the first place. Understanding that resource extraction leads to corruption, often on the ground, which leads to poor governance, which leads to discontent, poor socioeconomic conditions, discontent, unrest, protests sometimes, which leads to a violent response, which leads to conflict, which leads to displacement. But we rarely close that loop of connecting that end displacement to the start and the root cause. And a decolonial approach to migration and displacement will call on us all to work jointly on the root causes as much as we work on the solutions and the symptoms of these root causes. And lastly, I would offer that we think about a global dimension to the solutions that we're finding. We need new language for a common world, and the real urgency that we face, I think, is certainly one to rethink the imaginary. We need to expand the borders of what is possible, including in global governance. And this has been done before. In the aftermath of the nuclear war, acutely aware of the fragility of our world and sensing a unique momentum, men and women, academics, politicians, activists came together to craft a framework for how we live together on this planet, which we've inherited and still live with today. And so we live on the borders of their imagination at the time. And yet these borders are closing in daily, when we should be expanding them and broadening the framework. And here, really the role, I'm pleased to be speaking with you, because the role of academia in its noblest form is to generate knowledge for the greater good of society. And we need you as current and future academics to work with us practitioners and together stretch the limits of our imagination to match the scale of the challenges that we face. Some activists, some scholars, some civil society actors have already begun this work and have begun to imagine new global solutions. Things like global citizenship that would afford the same rights to all on the simple basis of our shared humanity, or a borderless world. You know, there are liberatory frameworks that are being explored right now. They appear, and they may appear unattainable or a utopia, as women's right to vote and to abort, or the end of racial segregation once was. But I think this is precisely the space, the territory that we must focus our common energies on. And I can tell you that at Amnesty, we have already started internal debates, discussions on what a rethink of our global architecture would look like, what a regathering of the 1948 spirit, this time led by those most excluded from global governance, would look like, and what it would yield in return. I think these are precisely the sort of discussions that we need to have, and I hope that you will be having them over the next few days of this conference. Because if indeed, to go back to the words of Professor Sarr, if we indeed are facing a crisis of relation and relationality, then it is at that level that we need to find solutions. And I would say, to begin to wrap up these words so I can open it up for a conversation, that it would not be unwise to return to indigenous ways of relating, of valuing life and all its beings. And here I'll mention a couple. First, one which is from my own culture, that is Ubuntu. This principle which measures a society by how it treats its people and its guests. You are human in proportion to how human you are to others. And therefore, a society that closes its borders to some and rewards others would not be viewed as human. I think reversing this narrative and rethinking this narrative from an indigenous perspective would make the act of unwelcoming the exception rather than the welcoming. It could be a powerful antidote to this rising anti-refugee and anti-migrant wave that we are, that I'm not sure we are currently prepared to face. And looking at, separately looking at indigenous ways of relating here in the Americas, and particularly here on Turtle Island, ways that see the world not as an assortment of fragments and territories, but really as a shared whole, might help us rethink our planet in peril. So as I said, I do not come with answers, but I hope that these reflections can contribute somehow to your own. And more importantly, I hope that we can continue these exchanges between, again, practice and academia, between activists and more formal civil society organizations, between the people who spend their time thinking about solutions for our future and the people who are immersed in the doing on a daily basis. I think this is precisely the space that we must together occupy, change, transform, and that this is our biggest source of hope. So I want to thank you for the important work that you do, the important thinking, theorizing that you do, and urge you to continue connecting and exchanging with us. We need you and as much, and I hope you need us as well. And I look forward to the conversation that we will have and the exchanges that will continue throughout the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ketty. The sad fact of online conferences is that you cannot hear the applause, which I am sure is being given to you for that talk. In some ways, I see your words as not only inspirational, but a bit of a call to action for us. Certainly the interaction between civil society and academia and how we can strengthen that and how we can multiply our influence in that way is something that we have definitely been thinking about here at CARFMS. I'd like to open up the question and answer period. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them below, and I will be happy to pass them on to our speaker, who will then be able to answer. We'll give it a few minutes. It always takes people a little while to get moving.
I have a comment and question. So thank you so much for your presentation and your talk on what are some of the things that we need to really be addressing and how can we move forward. And I really liked your discussion of language and how language is so important, right? How we identify people and the terminologies that we use when we're looking at refugees and forced migration. And so that really, you know, resonated with me. And I know sometimes people talk about a refugee crisis, and that creates a certain image and feelings around that. And I know many other people are also talking about, you know, it's really not, as you said, a crisis of the numbers. It's a crisis of political will, or it's a crisis of policies that are being put in place that prevent people from moving and seeking protection in another country. So I really like that. And you mentioned the crisis of relations. And I think that is very real in today's climate and environment. And so how can we build better relationships with one another? Because as we talk about in peace and conflict studies, relationship is key, right, to building peace. And I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about that in terms of what are your ideas in terms of how we can rebuild some of these relationships.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yes, I think the question of relation is really key. And when I mention relation, it's so yes, it starts at a cellular level, but it's largely a relationship between states, between blocks of states as well. It's a relationship of power between certain countries that are currently holding far more power over others, and how who this benefits in the end, right? And the understanding that a much more relational relationship that actually values not only the human rights but the well-being of people in the rest of the world is seen as part of the goals. Let's look at, you're talking rightly about the climate crisis, for instance. We're on the eve of COP27. We know that Canada is committing to clean energy. What we often don't hear enough is what is the cost of those clean energies and what these clean energies are and at whose expense they're being designed. And therefore we look at the emissions of Canada on Canadian soil without looking at the emissions of Canadian extractive industries, for instance, overseas and outside the borders of Canada. And so rethinking relationality would mean accounting as much for the emissions that are done externally, for the ways in which we extract these new clean energies, accounting it in how we look at reshaping our domestic delivery on climate change. It means counting that any solution that leaves others behind, any solution that harms Indigenous communities or any other community elsewhere in the world is not the right solution. It's a false one. It's that understanding that is crucial, and focusing energies on finding solutions that work for us all. There's no such thing as having a clean Canada with the rest of the world that is living from the consequences of those choices. So it's really expanding that praxis of that understanding of relationality beyond oneself and beyond one's borders alone.
Thank you very much. We have a few questions in the Q&A. For those who have not found it yet, it's at the bottom of your screen. I think there should be a Q&A button you can press to submit your question. So the first question comes from Lisa, and she would like to know your opinion on what do you see the vulnerabilities for women in the present and in the future? Or what do you see as the particular vulnerabilities for women in the present and the future?
well, women are the center of of displacement. When you talk about, when you see any population fleeing, it is always starts with women are the first ones to pick up, to move, to find new ways of relating, of being, of starting a life on new land. They are the ones who are actually tasked with the burden of displacement and are tasked with finding practical solutions in refugee camps. It is women who are organizing new life, who are finding new ways of adapting. Even here, I have found that in many of the communities that are even around me, it is the women who quickly go back to work, find ways while the men are still, nostalgic about a former life and unable to cope. So the reality is that the weight of displacement is really placed on the backs of women, and further render women even more, more vulnerable. And I'm careful here not to depict women as simply as victims, because we know that there are agents of change. We know that we are powerful agents of change, but this is a further, if you look at it from an intersectional perspective, this is a further barrier and a further shackle to women who are already having so many barriers to overcome in order to thrive. And so it's profoundly disproportionate and unfair that the bulk of this is falling on women. We know that half of the world's refugees are children. These children are either separated from their mothers, and so here behind every child who is displaced and who is alone is a mother who has lost her child and whose life is broken. Or these children are with their mothers, and this means this is a mother who's on the move with young children in desperate conditions. So of course, the woman is further rendered vulnerable, and the solutions have to be profoundly gendered and looked at from the lens of women, and designed by women.
Thank you very much. The next question's from Guillermo, and he says, according to UNHCR data, the vast majority of refugees are in lower middle income countries. What do you think about the fact that high income countries are not leading these inclusion processes?
Well, I think I spoke about that earlier, right? That's the fundamental issue. Not only are they not leading, they're also a major contributor in making people leave in the first place. And so when you see that over 80% of displacement is being done in low and middle income countries, and yet the narrative of invasion of massive numbers coming at borders is coming from the global north. There's a high disproportion right there. And so countries have a responsibility to not only open their borders, to expand how they relate to refugees and people on the move, but as I said earlier, have a responsibility as well to address the root causes that are making people flee in the first place.
I think the next question actually builds on this a little bit. It's stated in the context of the US, but I might expand it to other countries as well. This is from Robert, and he asks whether the US's insistence on a rules-based international order rather than a law-based international order is partially an attempt to block international laws and treaties to that might facilitate a fair movement of people. And I think this gets at perhaps the duplicity occasionally of higher income countries.
Yes, and it speaks to the real crisis, which is really a crisis of governance, a crisis of international governance. We have covenants, we have agreements that have been put in place, and yet which countries are doing everything to escape from. And so I do agree with your concern that having a rules-based order moves us away from key questions such as whose rules, set by whom, for the benefit of whom, rather than relying on instruments we already have, international law instruments we have, which obligate us to treat every human person with the dignity that they deserve. This is fundamentally, I think, one of the crises that we need to name, to address, and to hold countries to account. We're seeing more and more a collapse of the global framework, which was imperfect and remains imperfect now, but the only framework that existed. And now states sort of deciding what they will do individually in their countries when it comes to refugees and migrants, which is extremely, extremely dangerous. And that's precisely, I think, what I was calling for in my talk earlier, that we need those of us who are committed to a world where each individual has the right to live in dignity, need to expand that thinking and that border. And even the current international law framework that we have, we need to see it again with the lens of the time when it was created. And in my view, it needs to be fundamentally expanded. But that is active work that needs to be done both by academia, by practitioners, and by activists, and by people most concerned, refugees and migrants.
Now the questions are coming in fast and furious. So by the time we finish this, we'll have solved all the world's problems. So one interesting, building on this idea of crisis, an interesting comment from one attendee is, why do you think we're willing to call the migration crisis a crisis, but why don't we refer to the anti-migrant movement as a crisis that requires immediate attention? Would there be a way to flip that on its head, so to speak?
Absolutely, and I think I alluded to that earlier as well, in the sense that if we were to reframe what it is to be human, and I think we need to be careful not to just be reactive, but to be proactive. And if we were to reframe what it is to be human, what it is to be welcoming, what it is to be right, we would get ahead of some of these narratives. Indeed, the unwelcoming is the crisis. The hundreds and thousands of bodies that are lying at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea are the crisis. I fundamentally believe that in years to come, if we are able to overcome our inability to live together, which is driving the planet to probably irreversible outcomes. But if we are able to overcome this, I believe that generations to come will look at this time and will look at the migration levels and the crisis of unwelcoming, the same way we look back at slavery, the same way we look at the greatest genocides in our history, because this is simply unexplainable. But somehow the public discourse has made it invisible and has made it seem and it continues to see the movement of people as the crisis, whereas the reaction and the response and the militarization of borders that is now expanding beyond national borders into other states is indeed the biggest crisis. So I completely agree, and I think we need to be more active, more creative in how we address this challenge head on, and much more vocal and articulate about what the real issue is. That's one of the challenges that we'll have to face.
This next question actually builds on what you're talking about, these actions that are taken, these actions of unwelcome that are taken. And this comes from Julie Young, who is a professor and one of our executive committee members at CARFMS. And she thanks you first for your talk, and says, my question relates to state practices that seek to preempt, deter, interdict the movement of people seeking safety and security. I'm teaching a third-year class on geography of borders and displacement, and the students are shocked to learn about these externalization policies and practices. they wonder, how is this legal given that states like Canada have signed on to the Refugee Convention? How are they allowed to get away with it? So I guess the question is, where do you think the points for intervention might be in holding states to account for these policies that push people into conditions of greater precarity, as they either try to find ways to move despite the policies or remain unable to move?
Well, first of all, I'm so glad you're teaching geography of borders and displacement to third-year students. I think this is one of the very practical ways that we can tackle this issue. It's by preparing the next generation and setting, actually speaking truth to our children. And you know, wisdom comes from the mouth of children. And indeed, it is shocking. States should not be able to get away with this at all. The challenge that we have is that the international infrastructure that we had in place to counteract these evasions from states is not functional. This is the major challenge, whether you're talking about the United Nations or I mean, you know, treaty bodies are making constant recommendations to the states, but states are overriding them. So you're seeing a strengthening of nation states that simply disregards the international order. That is the challenge. And to me, the answer, this is the activist in me, that answer is and will always be in people and people power. People are the ones who elect, at least in some democracies like Canada, have the power to elect and to choose who leads them, have the power to set priorities for their leaders, and have the power to hold their own states to account. If we cannot count anymore on this international infrastructure, which needs to be revised overall. So I'm not saying we give up on it, absolutely not. It needs to be addressed. But in parallel, we have a lot of work to do in educating people and making people aware of these realities, making people aware of the obligations that states have. You will be surprised by often how little people know about the obligations that even a country like Canada has, and urging people to take action and to hold their own leaders to account. That's certainly the business that I am into, but it needs to be beyond the realm of activism. It needs to be in education. It needs to be in policymaking. It needs to be at all layers, within all layers of society, for us to face this. I mean, when you think about it, this is the only way that atrocities like slavery were abolished. They did not rely on some form of international law to come and tell states to stop it. It was people who organized and said, this is inhuman, this is enough, this must stop, and relentlessly organized with that ideal in mind, and eventually arrived at those results. And I think if we frame this issue the right way, as one of the absolute deepest failures of humanity, how we treat each other, how we rate the hierarchy that we place on human beings, and again, who's welcome to come and who isn't, then our solutions will also change drastically.
See, this is the hallmark of a very experienced speaker, in that you've answered the next two questions in that answer as well. One was about the role that education plays, and I think that you've touched on that quite a bit. The other was about whether or not the UN should be renovated or revised, and maybe building on that as well. One of the other attendees mentions that I share most of your sentiments, especially the vexing question of the asymmetrical power relations that define relationships between states and groups in the world. How do we reconfigure the asymmetries of power relations? And perhaps that in the global context, but then also, is there a role that the UN can play in this as well?
First of all, that's a huge one, right? And I hope it is going to be one that you explore. If I knew how to reconfigure global order, certainly I would be at it. But I think fundamentally we need to re-explore the foundation of the global order. And in many ways, they are currently being challenged. We are in a liminal space where the global order that actually worked and benefited the global north for so long is being fundamentally challenged. And we are in this space between two worlds where we don't know whether we're moving towards a greater evil than what we had or a lesser one. But it's a space of opportunity. And again, I go back to people power and being able to mobilize transnationally. Already, even within academia, just being able to share knowledge and to exchange and debate transnationally on what the nature of a new order could look like, particularly when it comes to refugees and migrants, is key. It's critical because fundamentally, this often is not taken as seriously within, in policy spaces, but the space of imagination is crucial. It's crucial, and we need to think about a new ways of relating and of being in the world that is not constricted by what we already know. We have the challenge, but also the incredible opportunity to think about a world where we all as individuals would belong, and what would the conditions look like for that to happen. That is a global task to all of us, but I think it begins with us seeing that as the goal and thinking towards that. There are some practical solutions. There's scholarship already that has started to explore these ideas. There are alliances that are being made by movements across the world who are claiming or who are hungry for a different word, a different distribution of power. It starts by lessening the clause that northern countries have on global south, whether it starts with resource extraction, whether it's proliferation of arms, whether it is, again, unequal economic systems. It begins with undoing those. And I think within academia, I would want to argue that what it requires is a closer relationship between migration scholars and those scholars who are working hard at decolonization and who are decolonizing knowledge and knowledge production. These two have to work hand in hand. People who are rethinking the order of our world need to think hand in hand with those who are exploring solutions for migrations. We will not be able to match solutions to the currents that we are facing if we don't think about it from a rethink of the global order. It sounds huge, it sounds impossible, but if we each take it within our field of work, I believe that we'll be able to advance, and we exchange and we continue to exchange and move forward. I believe that we'll be able to advance, and the world begs for it. Our life on our planet is simply no longer sustainable. I mean, experts are telling us, have rung all the alarms, all the red flags are waved. Life on Earth will not be possible if we continue at the rate and the level that we are. And that is intimately linked with production, how we produce, how we exploit, where we produce, who we displace, and how we disrupt life in these areas. All these are interconnected, and we need to think about them in a holistic way.
Thank you very much. I think your words are a warning, but also they have perhaps a little bit more optimism than some of us feel sometimes, which is a good thing. I have one final question that is a bit more specific, and this is one of our attendees is asking whether you can say anything about the Rwanda-UK Pact on migrants in the context of the anti-migrant crusade.
I think that pact speaks to a broader muscle and dynamic that is happening in the global north, which is simply to find deals, cutting deals to walk away from states' responsibilities to welcome and to host people. As I shared earlier, more than 80% of people who are displaced are already in low and middle income countries. And so these solutions are a way of evading responsibility from global north countries. When you think about the UK, home to, so the stock exchange and so many, often the turning point for so many products that are extracted from African continents, from the African continent and countries, and we do not look at that in relation to this pact of offloading migrants to another land. It's deeply problematic, right? So again, it links back to the responsibility of the global north and holding the global north to its dual responsibility, which is that of welcoming, yes, and welcoming adequately in a dignified way, offering socioeconomic conditions that are right and just for those that are welcomed. But again, going back to my earlier point, tackling the root causes of that displacement in the first place. When you see the funding of the war in much of the Middle East, whether it's the war in Yemen or in Syria or elsewhere, the majority of these of the funds and the arms that are enabling those crises can be tracked back. How are we holding the states accountable, and how are we connecting arms sales with, at the same time, people's displacement and responsibility, therefore heightened and added responsibility to host and to welcome. This evasion and delegation of refugees to far and distant lands is not only irresponsible, it is immoral. It is immoral, and of course, states have a choice globally. We should not prescribe the welcoming of refugees to the global north only. All states have a right to want to welcome people, but it should not be done in an attempt to evade states' core responsibilities towards refugees globally.
On that note, I would like to thank Ketty very much for coming and speaking to us today. I think this was an excellent start to the conference, and one that hopefully will give us a lot of fruit for discussion over the next few days. And for our attendees, I would like you all take 15 minutes, take a break, walk around, go get your lunches, and then I invite you to meet us back here at 12:30 for the book launch.